Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Gettysburg National Military Park, and of course, welcome to today's winter lecture. My name is Christopher Gwynn. I'm the Chief of Interpretation and Education at Gettysburg National Military Park, and as many of you have probably heard me joke before, I'm still learning exactly what that means. I often remark that about 80% of my day is spent kind of mired in bureaucracy, and on a particularly good day, I get 20% of what I would call history. So this is my 20%, at least for the weekend. So thank you for being here. And we have a lot to talk about and a lot to go over. So what I'd like to do is just kind of jump right into it. And I'd like to begin actually 25 years after the Battle of Gettysburg. 25 years after. The date is October the 16th, 1888. And let's imagine that we're with the citizens of Gettysburg along the Taneytown Road, along Baltimore Street, as they look out their windows and front stoops and their offices that line those roads. They could see that day a parade of marching men heading south towards the battlefield beyond. Now, by 25 years after the battle, that sight had become a common one, prompting among the residents of Gettysburg in nearly equal measure curiosity, celebration, perhaps even a twinge of sadness. Now, this particular procession, this parade, was composed of the surviving veterans of the 136th New York Infantry, formerly of the 11th Corps of the Army of the Potomac. And after a lapse of 25 years, these veterans had returned to the battlefield. The same soldiers that once defended the slopes of Cemetery Hill and the ridges south of town had now returned, and with them, instead of ambulances and ammunition wagons and caissons, were their children and grandchildren, wives, family members. And they looked out over a landscape that in most respects bore a very strong resemblance to that which they had encountered 25 years before. The odd house, an outbuilding, an occasional barn, but mostly open farm fields and orchards. And it's true, by that point the town had grown, new buildings had been built, new roads laid, and like their own, monuments had sprung up across the battlefield. But otherwise, Gettysburg still retained much of that same sense of place. The road where the men had fought was still there. The rock wall where they had sheltered themselves was still there. The tombstones in Evergreen Cemetery, they were still there too. All of it now kind of like them, relics of the battle, but still there. Their procession ended at their still shrouded monument along the Taneytown Road. And when they arrived, they gathered around it and performed the kind of ceremonial tableau that would be repeated time and again on the battlefield of Gettysburg. The veterans stood, heads bowed, caps doffed, as prayers were read, flags unfurled, speeches delivered, and poems recited. We think and speak of other fields, one soldier wrote, but not as we think and speak of Gettysburg. And Clinton Miner, who helped dedicate the monument that day, he talked about the monument and the fields that surrounded it as, quote, holy ground. It would be here, their monument along the Taneytown Road, where the men of the 136th New York would be remembered. And the veterans of the 136th New York and other Union veterans that would come to the battlefield and speak, they were speaking to themselves and to their family members, but also to future generations. And if you can distill their message down to its base alloy, their message is a fairly simple one. And that is, Gettysburg was the turning point of the war. It was the high water mark. It was the epic of the conflict. It's where the Confederate Army reached its zenith, where the blow that would ultimately destroy the Confederacy was struck, and everything that happened before was prologue, and everything that happened after was postscript. Gettysburg, Union veterans contended, ranked among the great battles of history, not only modern history, but antiquity as well. As one Union veteran said, as Greece had her Thermopylae and Marathon, and as the Battle of Waterloo decided the fate of Europe for 100 years, so Gettysburg decided the fate of this country for the next 100. Gettysburg, according to the veterans, the Union veterans, also signaled the beginning of the end of slavery. Veteran John Ramsey was a veteran of the 8th New Jersey. He would remind his fellow veterans that, quote, the result of the battle decided that this was to be a land of freemen, that the shackles of the slaves should be sold for old iron, that the auction block should be burned. Union veterans argued, at least many of them, that the skillful handling of the Army of the Potomac by George Meade earned George Meade a place in the pantheon of American heroes. It would also ultimately get him a statue on Cemetery Ridge. Union veterans stated again and again and again that it was the fortitude of the common soldier more than any other thing that won the battle. And so it would be this place, this battlefield, where they would be remembered. And so Union veterans returned to Gettysburg in the hundreds and thousands, and in so doing, helped to create the battlefield park that we have today. And they also helped to cement this narrative of Gettysburg as the turning point of the war. But these old men, these veterans who come back to the battlefield in their 50s and 60s and 70s, they had one great advantage that their former selves lacked. And that, of course, is the clarity that comes with hindsight. When they viewed the American Civil War, and here's a throwback to my time in English class, when they viewed the American Civil War, the 4 years of the conflict played out with this kind of wonderful narrative arc. So in 1861 and 1862, as the armies were formed, as they battled in Virginia and Maryland, the action rose. And the story reached its climax in June and July of 1863 with the Gettysburg Campaign. And then afterwards, in 1864 and 1865, the action descended to its logical conclusion. Union victory, freedom to the enslaved, democratic institutions preserved. To make a long story short, the war, when it was viewed backwards, made sense in a way that it hadn't while it was being fought. And so Union veterans looked at Gettysburg as the turning point because they knew what came next. They knew the end of the story. They had lived to see the campaigns of 1864, the siege of Petersburg, the re-election of Lincoln, the triumph of Grant over Lee at Appomattox. But how did Union veterans feel at the moment, immediately after the Battle of Gettysburg? How did they share the news of what happened there with their friends and family at home? How did they process and come to terms with the death of their friends and comrades? Did they still regard the Battle of Gettysburg as a turning point? What did they do in the days, weeks, and months that followed after? What was it like for them not to remember it, but to live it? And for the remainder of our time together today, I'd like to try to answer at least some of those questions. And to do that, I've established a relatively arbitrary time span for myself. What I'm going to do is look at the 3 or so months immediately following the Battle of Gettysburg, so July, August, September of 1863. And I'm going to limit myself to only those letters, diary entries, journal accounts that were written at the time, while the men were, again, living it, while they were engaged in marching and fighting. Nothing from the post-war period. And whether it's a letter written along the banks of the Potomac at Williamsport or amongst the woods at Warrenton, these letters and these diary accounts and these articles, they paint a very interesting portrait of the Union soldier after Gettysburg. They portray a Union soldier who recognizes what was accomplished at Gettysburg and also what was not accomplished. They portray a soldier whose physical exhaustion and ability to endure privation rivals, if not surpasses, their courage on the battlefield. They portray a Union soldier who cares about politics, who understands the connection between the battlefield and the home front. They show a Union soldier whose constant companion is fatigue and hunger, and who is often confused, prey to gossip and rumor, and unsure of the larger forces that decide fate. And they portray, at least in the summer of 1863, a Union soldier who is fighting, for more than any other thing, the right to go home with his head held up. And so let's join that soldier, and let's do so at the end of the battle. The evening, July 3rd, 1863. The battle was over, but no one then knew it, nor did it come to an abrupt halt that came to kind of a sputtering conclusion as skirmishers still fired, as pickets still blasted, as units moved and repositioned themselves. Charles Maddox of the 17th Maine, de Trobriand's brigade, that evening learned that General Sickles had died, and he recorded the news in his diary. Others along the Union battle line shared the news that George McClellan had arrived and taken command. In Webb's brigade, Philadelphians who had just repulsed Pickett's charge wrote about how they expected Little Mac's presence at any moment. An 11th Corps soldier reported seeing McClellan on East Cemetery Hill, riding down the Baltimore Pike, dressed as a woman. Less reliable reports placed James Longstreet among the wounded prisoners and Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard in another Confederate Army approaching from the south. Now, we all know none of this was true, but in the twilight of battle, to the men that were living it, any of it might be true. I can't tell what is going on now, one New Yorker lamented, so I will not try, for I hear so many rumors. Most believed that they had delivered a heavy blow to Lee's army, though even that depended very much on the soldier and his position on the battlefield. Along Cemetery Ridge, 2nd Corps soldiers counted up captured rebel battle flags. The final tally was around 20, but they were still finding them here and there in front of the stone wall. And this was more than had been taken by the Army of the Potomac in the first 2 years of the war combined. Ultimately, Meade's army would take over 40 during the battle. In front of the position of the 12th Corps on Culp's Hill, men collected discarded rifles like they were cordwood. Ira Jeffers of the 137th New York wrote home to his family and said, quote, "We fought the Stonewall Brigade and whipped them." The prisoners said that it was the first time they had ever been whipped. From the lower level of the George Spangler Barn, the 11th Corps Field Hospital, wounded men tried to gauge the progress of the battle by the muffled roar of rifle and artillery fire and the kind of ebb and flow of new arrivals to the hospital. And the soundscape was very difficult for them to read. What could be agreed upon by virtually everyone who survived it was that the night of July 3rd was singularly miserable. It rained, and so the ground was soaked, as were the men that slept on it. Everything was wet, and everything became muddy, and the groans of the wounded were unceasing. By dawn of July 4th, the situation had coagulated a bit. Men in the Army of the Potomac were now certain they had not lost, and most had come to the conclusion that Lee and the rebel army had been whipped. The oft-quoted Elijah Hunt Rhodes advanced towards the now vacant rebel battle lines and recorded, quote, "Was ever the nation's birthday celebrated in such a way before?" And he goes on to say, "This morning the 2nd Rhode Island was sent out front and found that during the night General Lee and his rebel army had fallen back." And still another wrote that, quote, "Bobby Lee will go home with his tail feathers." The euphoria of victory and of survival dissipated almost as quickly as the rebel army vanished from the battlefield. From the lower saddle of Culp's Hill, Lieutenant Colonel George Cobham, commanding the 111th Pennsylvania, described the scene. "All around me as I write, our men are busy burying the dead. The ground is literally covered with them, and the blood standing in pools all around me is a sickening sight." In front of the position of the 3rd Corps, the men noted the decaying smell, the stench in the air. "The stench has become awful," one said. "I should hate to live here." Other soldiers noticed that as soon as the armies left, new parties arrived. Gawkers, Good Samaritans, Army correspondents, journalists, nurses, surgeons, grave robbers. One recorded photographic artists taking views of groups of dead, graves, dead horses, etc. But most men that wrote home directly from the battlefield did so with what I would call an economy of language. And very typical was Oliver Norton of the 5th Corps. He wrote, "Dear Father, I am safe and well. We have met the enemy and given them hell. Colonel Vincent is mortally wounded. Al Fairs is safe, so is Conway. No time for more." Still near Gettysburg on the 6th of July was Captain Henry Livermore Abbott of the 20th Massachusetts. And he's a young officer. He's well educated. He belongs to the Harvard Regiment. He's daring. He had led men in some of the most desperate situations of the war, from the streets of Fredericksburg to the debacle at Ball's Bluff. And he assumed command of the 20th Massachusetts at the height of Pickett's charge. And during that fighting, he had lost one of his good friends, a young soldier named Henry Ropes. And on July 6th, he would write to his father and say this: "When our great victory was just over, the exultation of victory was so great that one didn't think of our fearful losses. But now I can't help feeling a great weight in my heart. Poor Henry Ropes was one of the dearest friends I had ever had or expect to have. He was one of the purest-minded, noblest, most generous men I ever knew. His loss is terrible." And here I think we can see Abbott struggling to put into words the seemingly irreconcilable. By turns euphoric and by turns distraught, Union soldiers, they struggled to process what they had just gone through, what they had survived. But I think most recognized that Gettysburg had been a victory, but it was a victory that was followed by a comma and not by an exclamation point or a period. I think most Union soldiers on the battlefield, they recognized that the war wasn't over and they hadn't destroyed the Confederate Army. And George Cobham, he spoke for nearly all when he wrote, quote, "I think the rebels will make another stand between here and the Potomac." And over the next 2 days, the men of the Army of the Potomac marched away from the battlefield. They left behind those that could not march, either because of deaths or wounds, and the Army was still very much coming to grips with just how many men that might be. And the confusion of battle made casualties very difficult to quantify. Some thought dead were only wounded. Some thought wounded were dead, and in the space between, a great many men were simply missing. Ira Jeffers of the 137th New York and his best friend Will Dodge, for example, had gone into battle together on July 2nd. In the confusion of the night fighting, they became separated. And it was only after that Ira Jeffers learned his best friend, Will Dodge, had been wounded in the leg. And he was sent to one of the hospitals along Rock Creek. It was told to Jeffers that his leg wasn't broken, so it was likely he'd survive. And Jeffers left Pennsylvania with the knowledge that his best friend was probably going to live. The ghost of George McClellan that had floated over the ranks of the Army July 3rd and 4th vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared, as other rumors took shape and took form. Meade was still in command, but exactly what the order of battle looked like between Meade and any individual soldier was a matter of speculation. A soldier in Henry Abbott's Harvard Regiment, for example, 20th Massachusetts, they began the battle with the well-known Winfield Scott Hancock in Corps Command. And after the battle, they learned that the almost totally unknown William Hayes was in charge. Most men probably couldn't have recognized that soldier on the battlefield for $1,000. In the 114th Pennsylvania, for a soldier that helped defend the Sheriff Peach Orchard on July 2nd, virtually nothing of the chain of command remained intact. In Company F, Captain Francis Fix had been wounded, as had First Sergeant Robert Crushman. Regimental Commander Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Cavada had been captured, along with Brigade Commander Charles Graham. The vacuum of command resulted in a new division commander and a new corps commander to make good on the wounded Daniel Sickles, so that nothing was as it had been for a soldier in Company F between him and the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Captain Francis Donaldson of the 118th Pennsylvania noted the mood as the men left Pennsylvania and crossed into the Maryland border. And most of you know from accounts of soldiers who left Maryland into Pennsylvania on July 1st or June 30th, it was the celebratory time. Flags were uncased. Music was played. The atmosphere, Donaldson writes, is very, very different as the men leave Pennsylvania. He writes, now no notice whatever was taken of the fact of leaving the state. And for many, the weeks after the battle was more taxing than the battle itself. The euphoria and shock had kind of hardened into what I would call, I guess, this steely resolve. And really the pursuit of the rebel army for the Army of the Potomac becomes this act of endurance more than anything else. Some men, such as those in the 6th Army Corps, they initially pursued the Confederates directly west down the Fairfield Road, but ultimately, almost the entirety of the Army of the Potomac heads south to the east of the Catoctin and South Mountains, down hopefully to Frederick, and then through the gaps in the mountains. The idea was to cut off Lee from his escape at the fords of the Potomac. We've been straining every nerve, one soldier wrote to his sister. Thousands of men are barefoot, and officers too. But they are bravely struggling on, footsore and hungry, enduring everything without a murmur so that we may finish the war now. And in the rain and the heat and the endless marching, men end up recording miles, kind of the way they recorded battles on their regimental flag. My health is good, one man said. If it was not, we could not stand marching as we are doing. Day before yesterday, we marched 28 miles. Another tallied that his regiment had marched 250 miles since leaving the Rappahannock, and he predicted another 250 in the month to come. But still he felt optimistic. This soldier wrote, quote, "This style of campaigning agrees with me excellently. I never felt better in my life." If men were optimistic, and if they found these kind of untapped inner reserves of strength, it was because most believed that the end of the war was at hand. Most believed, if the machine was driven till the tank was empty and the gears locked, well, that's what it had to happen for the war to end. And most men then took the hardship in stride. They slogged the rainy nights. They endured the shortage of food, lack of sleep, and the endless miles that seemed to blur together. "I will try and not grumble or find fault with the hard marching and privations we have to endure," one man wrote. "I feel confident peace is close at hand and that I shall soon be home again with my parents and friends." The road from Gettysburg took men through a lot of familiar towns and villages and places, many of which the men had marched through on their way to Gettysburg. Places like Littlestown, Tawnytown, Emmitsburg, Frederick, Middletown, Boonesboro, Sharpsburg. Men in the 1st, 2nd, 5th Corps trudged past the battlefields of September of 1862 at South Mountain. Some of them actually crossed Burnside Bridge during their pursuit of Lee's army, and the tide of emotion that must have swept over these men as they saw these places. And as the days and miles passed, the sense of an impending battle, the sense of urgency continued to grow. And through a kind of osmosis, this urgency spills into the riding of the men. I'm almost tired, worn out, haven't had my shoes off for a week, lying sometimes in the heaviest of rain without a shelter, not allowed a minute of my own, and you can see I have but little time to write, one man wrote from Sharpsburg. And as the urgency grew, so too did the stakes, because around this moment, the men of the Army of the Potomac learned that Vicksburg had fallen. Now, some of the men reported as early as July 5th, but by this point, July 9th, it's known throughout the Army. And also, that same day, July 9th, the Confederate garrison at Port Hudson surrenders, along with 7,000 men. And only a few days later, that word makes it to the Army of the Potomac. By the 12th of July, it appeared to the men in the Army of the Potomac that their moment was up. Their moment was at hand. After days of intense marching, they caught up to the Army of Northern Virginia at Williamsport. And the men in the ranks, from their very limited vantage point, they tried to appraise the situation. And it was clear that the rebels had their backs to the Potomac River, that the hammer was ready to kind of deliver the crushing blow, and everyone just waited for that moment to happen. Ira Jeffers of the 137th New York reported that the rebels are said to be entirely surrounded, and the Potomac is up, so they can't ford it. And our men have destroyed the pontoon bridges, so they are in a pretty tight spot. Another man wrote that it would, quote, require all of Lee's generalship to save the Army. And there's this pregnant moment of expectation where men are riding home that they believe at any moment they're going to be advancing. And then the next day, Monday, July 13th, nothing happens. Charles Maddox of the 17th Maine wrote, quote, Monday, July 13th, near Antietam. The same and more so. Same place, same rain, no fight, nothing real but rain. On the 14th day of July, Union forces advanced on Williamsport to find empty entrenchments. Somehow Lee had been able to escape across the Potomac. We followed the rebels as fast as possible to Williamsport, one man noted. They got away from us again, and now we cannot catch them this side of Richmond. The men have pressed on since the fight, barefooted, hungry, lousy, and faint. The universal emotion after the Williamsport crossing was one of disappointment and resignation. During those weeks of furious marching from Gettysburg to the Potomac, there was this common refrain that was voiced by virtually everyone who left an account of it. And that was that they hoped the end of the war was near. The end of the war, the end of campaigning, the end of wet marches and sleepless nights. And it was that more than any other thing that propelled the men south. And so on July 14th, when they find that Lee had escaped, rather than looking at it as some sort of reprieve or gallows pardon, the fact they had avoided having to assault the entrenchments outside of Williamsport, the way that later in the war they would write about Mine Run or Cold Harbor, the men write about it with disappointment. This wasn't the end, as much as they hoped it would be. A few tried to find a silver lining. Elijah Hun Rose wrote that he thought it unlikely that Lee would have much of a stomach for an invasion again. We got more out of the rebels this time than McClellan did at Antietam, he said. And that too without being 2 or 3 times at Bull Run and Chantilly and running to Washington for protection. On July 17th, another Union soldier wrote to his parents from Harper's Ferry and attempted to kind of mitigate expectations in the home front. He wrote, I suppose the people at home will think we ought to have captured them all, but that is a thing much easier to talk about than to do. And it's here that most narratives of the Gettysburg campaign, they come to an end. Lee's army escaped across the Potomac into Virginia. Abraham Lincoln pens this agonizing letter to George Meade talking about how the enemy was within your easy grasp and now the war will be prolonged indefinitely. Lincoln never sends the letter. Meade offers his resignation anyways, and that's where the period occurs. That's the end of the campaign. And yet, to those that lived it, July 15th looked a whole lot like July 14th, and that looked a whole lot like July 13th. And there was no clear demarcation that separated one chapter of history from another. And so for most of the men, the war would continue, the marching would continue, and perhaps even a speedy pursuit of Lee could still end it. On the 18th of July, the 5th Army Corps, at least part of it, crossed the Potomac. And Captain Francis Donaldson of the 118th Pennsylvania noted the crossing back into Virginia was punctuated by curses and groans uttered from the men who, quote, detest the soil of Virginia. My own feelings at again entering the state can be imagined better than described. Even the name, he wrote, Virginia, is hateful to me. It was, he said, the graveyard of the Army of the Potomac. The Union soldier, after his return back to Virginia, encountered a landscape that was very, very different from what he had seen in Pennsylvania. And one Union veteran of Gettysburg remarked at how lucky the people of Pennsylvania had been to get rid of the Confederate Army as quickly as it had. And he wrote to his mother, he wrote, I wish, my dear mother, that I had something to write that would interest you, some description of beautiful scenery, or a visit to some of the thriving towns and fine old homesteads. Such things at present, he said, exist but in fancy. The same soldier went on to chronicle the state that he was marching through, and he said it was one wide scene of desolation and woe. Every house you pass is either partially or altogether in ruins. Not a man is to be seen unless it be some old gray-haired man. At every house that remains, 2 or 3 women are to be seen, and 9 out of every 10 are dressed in deep mourning for some brother, husband, or son who will return no more. I feel very thankful that the scenes I witnessed around me are not carried to my own home. The war continued, but now with both armies to the south of the Potomac. For the men in the ranks, the theater of operation might have changed, but beyond that, very little else had. And for most, the exhausting marching continued. And from Loudoun County, Virginia, men wrote of a physical exhaustion that went beyond just sheer exhaustion to something else, something deeper. They complained of sickness, fatigue. A soldier in the 83rd Pennsylvania wrote that I am near sicker than I have been in a year, and that if he could walk at all, he'd walk to a hospital. Sickness ravaged the ranks not just because of the strain and the fatigue of the campaign, but also too because of the enormous filth. As the men had counted miles, now too they started to count the number of days they had gone without bathing or changing clothes. The men were, quote, lousy. You hardly know what that means, one man wrote home, but if you were in the ranks you would. Not head lice, but body lice that crawl all over your shirt and pants. And one soldier wrote home with a very admirable candor and great simplicity. He wrote, quote, I am at present really filthy dirty. He admitted to his mother he hadn't changed his clothes in 2 weeks. Men noticed, too, the roads were lined with dead horses, animals that had literally been worked to death. A 5th Corps soldier wrote that marching had been the order of the day since the Army returned to Virginia, but he couldn't see how the Army could possibly keep it up. I think we will now have to stop, as our horses are giving out. They die by the hundreds daily. The past few weeks have been a fearful experience. Artillerymen especially noticed the severe toll the march that was taking on their animals. One artilleryman noted, quote, the horses are worn out. Every day's march killing from 5 to 20 in each battery. In addition to the horses, men continued to die. On July 23, 1863, outside the town of Linden, Virginia, Sergeant Major Fred Bosworth of Company A, 17th Maine, was hit by a 6-pound solid shot fired from one of the Confederate artillery pieces, and the wound had been in the thigh and it was clearly fatal. But the 20-year-old, he proved resilient. He lived into August. And few in his regiment that wrote about his death could really assign any particular importance to it, or for any of those who would continue to die of sickness and disease and from combat in these nameless skirmishes and inconsequential battles. In the camp of the 20th Massachusetts, a month and a half later, a man was murdered. It happened at night. The assailant fled into the darkness, and at first it was assumed to have been committed by some recently arrived draftee. Others came to the conclusion that the murder must have had something to do with a woman. Officers in the regiment took the loss particularly hard, as the victim, Captain Thomas McKay, was one of the most popular men in the regiment. On July 27th, while the Army was near Warrenton, Virginia, Ira Jeffers of the 137th New York learned that his friend Will Dodge, whom he'd last seen before the fighting on Culp's Hill, had died. He had been wounded in the leg, and initially it was thought the bone wasn't broken, but it turned out it was. And on July 13th, his leg was amputated, and Will Dodge died that same day. And Jeffers, in his letters, writes about the agony that he's facing because he knows that he'll probably have to be the one to tell Dodge's parents. And he describes the feeling of losing that friend. He wrote, "He was to me almost a brother, and now that he is gone, it seems almost as though I was left alone among strangers." And to compound the pain, letters to Will Dodge continue to arrive in the mail, and these Jeffers dutifully collected. Not only did men continue to die, but the losses that had been sustained at Gettysburg really whittled away most regiments to a shadow of what they had once were. Take, for example, the Excelsior Brigade. The Excelsior Brigade fights the Battle of Wapping Heights on July 23rd, and when they did so after having lost 42% of their men at the Battle of Gettysburg, on top of the losses they sustained at Chancellorsville. 9-month regiments, like the 153rd Pennsylvania, the 13th Vermont, which had seen action at Gettysburg, were now leaving the Army entirely. And George Meade is watching the Army that he inherited atrophying in front of him. The Lincoln administration's response to this was the Enrollment and Conscription Acts of 1863, better known as the draft. And the hope was to motivate fresh volunteers into the ranks with not a draft, but with a threat of a draft. And if that didn't work, the draft itself would take place. And each congressional district was given a quota. They had to fill the quota. First draft was in July of 1863. In the unlikely event that your name happened to be called in the draft, a number of things could conceivably happen, the least likely of which, as James McPherson writes, was military service. You could fail to report, and 1 out of 5 men did this. Just go to Canada, go west. Just don't show up. 3/5 of those drafted were sent home for medical disabilities, and that could be any number of things. In a neighborhood of Boston, men were exempted for crooked toes, a single disabled toe, tender feet, odd skin growths. One man was sent home for varicose veins. Another was sent home for excessive stammering. 40% of the men drafted in Boston got a medical exemption. You were exempted if you could prove you were the sole support for a widow or an orphan sibling or a motherless child. You could hire a substitute, normally an 18 or 19-year-old or an immigrant. Or if you didn't do all that, well, you could pay $300. That would get you out of this draft, but not necessarily a future draft. And there were a lot of ways to cheat the system. Surgeons could be bribed. Documents proving a dependency could be forged. Some men went as far as self-mutilation. The $300 fee was roughly what a Irishman in New York would make in a year. And there was a lot of anger over the draft, particularly among the immigrant and the poorer classes. Among the streets of Boston, the popular song, "We Are Coming, Father Abraham, 300,000 more," was changed to "We Are Coming, Father Abraham, $300 more." And as Union soldiers marched away from Gettysburg, and as the massive casualties were just being made known, the draft commenced. And as we all know, it erupted in violence. In New York on July 13th, a draft riot began. The rioters, primarily immigrants, mostly Irish, destroyed public property. They attacked Republican and abolitionist establishments, set the police stations on fire. They set the colored orphan asylum ablaze. They murdered and lynched black people. The rioting lasted for 4 days before men from the Army of the Potomac and others subdued the mob. The casualties from the New York draft riots were almost as difficult to quantify as the casualties at Gettysburg. There were at least 2,000 of them. Damages amounted to over $2 million. And news of the incident, news of the riot, struck the members of the Army of the Potomac like a lightning bolt. And they processed it in the same way that we do today, by viewing it through whatever political leanings they had and crafting around it a narrative. Henry Abbott of the 20th Massachusetts was many things, but he was not a Republican and he was not an abolitionist. Henry Abbott had no love for Abraham Lincoln, and he saw in the draft riot violence and the mob. He saw in it all proof of the failings of the Lincoln administration. He writes, "The vilest rowdies in New York have shown the fruit of Lincoln's teaching. The next election alone can save the country. I wish to God it would come now." Most, though, viewed the draft riots and the resistance to the draft as virtually the same thing as fighting for the Confederacy. If you had to simplify men's messages, that was it. You're rioting, it's the same as fighting for the Confederacy. And most men said what they wished was that the mob would come south and get their bellies full of Confederate lead, or, more preferably, send the Army of the Potomac up to New York City. One man wrote, quote, "Every copperhead, peace man, anti-draft man, every cursed mother's son of them that does not support the war by word and deed ought to be hung or sent to the South where they belong." Elijah Hunt Rhodes wrote, the day that Lee crossed the Potomac, "The riots in that city are a disgrace to the nation and not to be suppressed at any cost of money or life." And ultimately, as we all know, the draft went on, much to the displeasure of the men that found themselves drafted. And about a month later, in the camps of the Army of the Potomac, the first draftees, the first conscripts arrived. They were delivered under guard to virtually all of the regiments in the Army of the Potomac, and now these veteran regiments had to incorporate these new arrivals, these draftees. And expectations, as a general rule, were not particularly high for these men. To the rugged campaigners of the Army of the Potomac, these replacements looked like men who didn't want to be in Virginia, which of course they didn't. They weren't. They were mostly poor, and they were mostly foreign, both of which were marks against them in the often very class-conscious and nativist Army of the Potomac. And again, first impressions had not been positive. Getting them south had been like herding cats. The drafted men exhibited a tendency to desert, which is perhaps understandable, given the circumstances under which they joined the Army. Typical, though, was the situation in the 118th Pennsylvania. Company Commander Frank Donaldson reported that on the 6th of August, as his brigade was encamped at Rappahannock Station, 109 draftees and substitutes arrived, but not before 50 of them deserted. The new men were divided up among the companies, and now Donaldson found himself with 12 new recruits under his command. 5 were immigrants, at least 3 were German, and 3 claimed to have at one time been officers in some of the 90-day regiments that had been formed at the beginning of the war. One, a man by the name of von Schlimbeck, said that he had once been a brigadier general in command of a brigade. And all of them still addressed one another by their former Army ranks, colonel, captain, and so forth, until Donaldson put a stop to it. They were, according to Donaldson, a fearful lot of loafers and bummers. That wasn't Donaldson's biggest problem, though. His biggest problem was that he had been given, quote, 5 Quakers. How to get them to take a musket is a mystery yet to be solved. In describing the draftees and the conscripts, men use phrases like rogues and hard nuts, drunkards, rowdies. One 12th Corps soldier noted that most of the conscripts looked like men who'd much rather be in a grog shop, which is, for some of them, probably true. In one 2nd Corps regiment, it was reported that of the 180 draftees they received, 30 had deserted, and another 40 had been sent to the hospital, ill, it was said, of diseases they had when they arrived. To the veterans of Gettysburg and Chancellorsville, these new men were really just this jumbled lot of nearly unpronounceable Dutch, French, Italian, German, in some cases Chinese names, men who were just as apt to shoot them as they were the enemy. Now, one man wrote, the orders are never to put a conscript on outpost without an old man in his company. Very bad to have half your army guarding the other half. For the men of the Army of the Potomac, the Gettysburg veterans, the draft was a failure. Rather than lifting their morale, it had deteriorated it, degraded it. And in true, many of the conscripts were poor soldiers. Many of the charges leveled against them were not without merit. But even the most earnest, most brave of draftees was put in this unwinnable situation. In part because if the draft had not been designed to ensure animosity between the reinforcement and the reinforced, it had in implementation achieved something very, very like it. It virtually ensured that those from the bottom of society ended up in the ranks. And as such, it wronged the draftee doubly. First, for preying on the poor and the marginalized, and second, for subjecting them unfairly to the prejudices of the men already in the ranks. How could a draftee or a conscript or a substitute, no matter how brave, no matter how patriotic, possibly replace men like Henry Rhodes, or William Dodge, or Fred Bosworth, Thomas McKay, or any of the men who now occupy the thousands of graves that littered the paths of the armies? How could a draftee or a $300 man walk into the camps of the 2nd Wisconsin or the 5th New Hampshire, and in the eyes of his new comrades, possibly replace the men that had been lost. For the Gettysburg veteran, though, most stinging of all, these men that had been motivated by the patriotic ideals of 1861 and 1862, these men that had buried comrades at Antietam and Manassas and Fredericksburg, well, these men now knew exactly how much they were worth. They might not know the number of miles they marched. They might have difficulty quantifying the number of casualties they suffered, but they knew how much their government valued them. That, of course, was $300. Desertion among the conscripts was so frequent and so prevalent that the Army was forced to come down hard, which it did at the end of August and the first weeks of September. On August 29th, General Charles Griffin of the 5th Corps ordered the entirety of the 1st Division to form up in an empty field as 5 bounty jumpers from the 118th Pennsylvania were to be executed. And the division formed up along 3 sides of a hollow square in front of freshly dug graves. A procession came in, a band playing this very mournful dirge, men carrying coffins, and finally the condemned men who were going to be shot. Many men witnessed this scene, and virtually all of them wrote about it, so the theatrics apparently made an impression. Of the 5 condemned men, 2 were Protestant, 2 were Catholic, and 1 was Jewish. So a priest, a minister, and a rabbi were on hand. 50 riflemen, 10 each for the 5 convicted men, waited for the order to fire, and at 3:45 p.m. it came. It is a very solemn thing to see human beings led forth to be shot like dogs, and those who witness such scenes receive an impression that can never be shaken off, one 20th Maine veteran wrote. Another wrote that, quote, "I have seen men shot on the battlefield, men with heads shot off, men with arms and legs gone, passed them all without a thought." Another wrote basically the same thing, but he said somehow there was something different in this execution. If the scene made an impression on the men that witnessed it, it also made an impression on the war correspondents and newspapermen that witnessed it as well. And accounts of this appeared in a lot of the northern newspapers. Oliver Wilcox Norton wrote to his family and wrote, "If you see anything in any of the accounts about the bugler, well, that was me." Similar scenes played out in virtually all of the corps of the Army of the Potomac, to much the same effect. Some men, like Henry Abbott, again blamed Lincoln, but most hoped that it would curb desertion, as tough as a sight as it was to see. After the execution at Raccoon Ford in September, Ira Jeffers penned a very shaky description of the scene. And then he ended with writing, quote, "I hope that I shall never be tempted to desert." And I think we can see in the construction and wording of that sentence a soldier who is unsure of the future and maybe also unsure of himself. A soldier who, even after witnessing the horrors of a military execution, recognized the possibility that he too may be pushed past the point of endurance, and that he too may be the one that ends up sitting on the edge of his own coffin. The summer of 1863 ended with rumors. Very few men at this point reported that they believed the end of the war was at hand. That hope seems to have been buried somewhere between the Potomac and the Rappahannock River, the graveyard of the Potomac Army. In the camps of the 12th Corps, it was reported that Charleston, South Carolina had surrendered, and that the stars and stripes flew over the battered walls of Fort Sumter. Others had heard that George Meade was to be replaced, and still others heard that they were to be sent to Kentucky, Georgia, Tennessee. Some of this was true, some of it wasn't, but to the men in the ranks, any of it might be true. No one could see the future terribly clearly, and so they guessed and they speculated. What in 10 or 20 or 30 years would be very obvious was, in the moment, a mystery. And that includes the importance of the battle they had fought at Gettysburg. No one then in the Army of the Potomac would refute the fact that the Battle of Gettysburg had been anything other than a titanic clash, and no one would say that the sight of retreating rebels and stacked up flags and rifles had been anything other than a clear indication of victory. The immediate importance of the battle to the men that won it was the fact that they had won it. They had beaten Lee. And while they might write home of the drubbing they gave the rebels and the feeling of euphoria that came with their victory, very few at this point would venture beyond saying much more than that. What was perhaps more obvious was the fact that by the end of the summer of 1863, the Army of the Potomac was not the same army that it once had been. Something in it had changed. Something had metastasized. Gone were the days of the strictly volunteer armies. Renowned units, the Iron Brigade, the Irish Brigade, the Excelsiors, they might exist in name, but they were no longer the same units that marched out to the fields at Antietam and Chancellorsville and Gettysburg. Within that year, the 1st and 3rd Corps, destroyed after the Battle of Gettysburg, were disbanded, and their regiments consolidated into other organizations. By the spring campaigns of 1864, the 11th Corps and the 12th Corps were gone. They'd been sent to Georgia. The Army of the Potomac was a different organization. Not necessarily better, not necessarily worse, just different. In their 50s and 60s and 70s, Union veterans returned to the battlefield at Gettysburg. They erected their monuments, like the men of the 136th New York. We started talking about them. On most, they recorded the names of the battles they fought, the losses they had suffered. They dedicated these monuments with speeches and orations, and attached to the battle an importance magnified by the passage of time. But in the immediate aftermath of the fighting, amidst the wreckage and destruction of war, nothing was ever that clear. On the lower slopes of Culp's Hill, surrounded by pools of blood, Lieutenant Colonel George Cobham watched as his men buried rebels in mass graves and stacked up thousands of captured rifles. And during the lull in the rain, he took an opportunity to write home. And at first, he wrote about mundane things. His wife, Annie, had informed him that their roof at their house had sprung a leak, and he gave suggestions on how to repair it. He said that when he got home, he would replace it with tin, even though tin was expensive. He wrote about mundane, everyday things, like he expected to live. He then attempted to describe the battle and wrote about the men that he saw killed. He writes, "As one sees his former companions and friends fall one after the other, he feels a sort of bulldog determination to give as good as he gets." Gettysburg was a turning point for the Union volunteer, not because it signaled the beginning of the end, nor because its strategic and tactical significance meant some important momentous event for the Union effort, but rather because it demonstrated that the men in the Army of the Potomac, they could win. It cemented in them that belief and that bulldog determination that Cobham writes about that would carry them past the unknowable miles to be marched, privations to be endured, graves to be dug, and battles to be fought. And so that, I believe, is why Gettysburg is a turning point for the men that wrote about it. And with that, I'll bring us to a conclusion. Thank you all for being here. I hope you took something out of it.